Yeah, it started at, I think it was the first televised debate between Kennedy and Nixon, 1960. And Dad was a young man then, about 32, 33, and he was selected to be NBC's representative on the panel.
Right.
And he asked both candidates tough questions, but specifically he asked Vice President Nixon a tough question about experience, which Nixon had been running on. And Nixon didn't like that and would later call it an event which would plague him for the rest of the campaign. And my dad also thought that Nixon didn't like my dad's coverage of Vietnam. So all of that combined ended up with my dad being on Nixon's initial enemies list.
Right. Welcome to Motivational Mondays, Conversations with David Ibarra, and I am delighted today to have as our guest, Chris Vanocur. Welcome, Chris.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure. I'm a fan.
Well, I tell you what, I grew, when I first moved back to Utah, I want to start by saying I got hooked on the Chris Vanocur show. You, Randy Horahuchi, Bruce Beard, and one other person I can't quite remember.
Might have been David Owen.
David Owen, and you would have every Sunday, if I'm not mistaken, and I watched that program. I bet you I've watched almost every episode. It's been a pleasure. Tell me about how did that get started? How did you start that program?
Essentially, these are some of the people that I would call on a weekly basis, say what's going on. You know, what do I need to know about? What should I be covering in the news? And also, I use them to help educate me about Utah and about Utah politics. And somehow we just ended up on the air on Sunday mornings, and they would pretty much on a routine basis scare the heck out of me.
Well, I'll tell you what, you had some colorful conversations between Randy Horahuchi, who just had he had an absolutely unbelievable personality, and then Bruce's sarcastic wit. It was, and then you had David Owens, who was the normal person of the group.
Oh, I don't know if I'd call him normal, but you're right. He wouldn't say much, but when he spoke, everybody on the panel listened.
Yes. It was a fun program, and I loved talking about politics, and they always were able to keep their humor about it. Even though being sarcastic, they kept their humor. It was a great show, and I'm sorry it's still not on.
Well, one of the great lessons my dad taught me is keep your sense of humor. You're going to need it.
Well, I think this came out of your book. I wanted to talk about this today. This is a book that just was released. In 2024?
Last couple of years, yeah.
Yeah, a couple of books, and it's Sanders' Study, and this is a son's story about his father, a journalist, reporter. Tell us about how you came about deciding to write it, and if you would, I want you to go all the way back and tell us a little bit about growing up, you're with a famous reporter, and how you decided to become one.
That's a lot to chew on.
That is.
I decided to write the book. This was probably 8 to 10 years ago. My dad was still alive, but getting on in years, probably mid to late 80s. And my stepmother called me one day. They lived in California, and of course I'm here in Utah. And she said, would you like to come out and go through Dad's stuff? He's not really quite up to it anymore, and we want to donate it to his alma mater, Northwestern University. So, of course, I said yes. They lived near Santa Barbara, California, which is beautiful.
Beautiful.
So who doesn't want to go out there for a few weeks? And I didn't really know what to expect, except that he had a lot of filing cabinets and a lot of files, and he hadn't been through them probably for years, decades. And as I started going through them, with my background being a reporter, I started thinking, this is a pretty interesting story. Somebody should tell it. And then being a little bit slow myself, I realized, well, maybe I should be the one to do it.
Right.
And as I went through the things, his files, his papers, speeches, articles, because he was a bit of a print reporter before TV reporter, I learned, not only did I learn quite a bit, but I was surprised by some things. And so after we got it packed up and sent to Northwestern, I spent a number of years writing the book or trying to write the book. You know this.
Yes.
Perhaps the most important thing is finding the voice. What voice are you going to tell the story? And initially I started as a traditional biography, born here, grew up here, yada, yada.
Right.
Sorry to yada, yada you. And it didn't work. Not only did I have trouble writing it, but it wasn't very good. Luckily, I've got some smart friends, and a couple of them suggested, your career, my career, is pretty interesting. Have you thought about combining it? And so that kind of gave me a dual narrative track to tell the story. And after that, it kind of fell into place. And then, for better and for some people, of course, much worse, the pandemic hit. And another friend of mine said, Chris, you've run out of excuses to finish the book.
Right.
You're home all day. This is your chance. And that really stuck with me.
When I wrote my first book, it wouldn't be shocking to you, but I got to chapter 3 and 8 years went by. And I just couldn't find the voice. And then the pandemic came, and I had decided I was going to write down some things that I said I would do if only I had the time. And one, getting in shape again, getting back to where I once was as a younger man, and writing this book. Both came to mind, so accomplishing them both. But I also found that in your voice in writing this book, not only was it talking in the voice of a reporter, it was really touching, and it was in the voice of a son talking about his father. And, when we talk about our dads, it's funny, just for a moment, I caught a little emotion, and I never know when it's going to happen. It just happens. And I think, God, I'm sure glad I feel that way about my dad.
I was about to say, I think that's a good thing, isn't it?
Yes, it sure is.
That we still hold them in our memory.
Yeah. Well, tell us, what did you find? First of all, tell the audience a little bit about your dad. Where was he a reporter? I mean, him and Walter Cronkite was the news.
Dad started, first he worked for a couple of newspapers in Britain, and then when he came back to the States, he started working for this small independent paper, the New York Times.
Yes.
You've heard of it.
Yes, I've heard of that small paper.
And as I mentioned in the book, it wasn't necessarily a good fit. They liked Dad, but he didn't necessarily have the print background that some of their reporters did. So he actually got fired by the New York Times. And years later, it became kind of an amusing story for him. But luckily, he had some contacts at NBC News, and he started working there, doing various jobs. And they tried him out reporting, and it was kind of a natural fit. And so probably between 60 and early 70s, that's where he made his name at NBC News, specifically on the Huntley-Brinkley Report, which, of course, I watched religiously as a child. And as I talk about in the book, he really covered the major stories of the 60s. John Kennedy, civil rights story, which he loved. Vietnam, which he had a lot of conflicting thoughts about.
Right.
And then, I don't know if I want to call him his nemesis or archenemy, but Richard Nixon. And he was, if not the lead reporter on those stories all the time, certainly he was in the forefront.
Right. And when you talk about Richard Nixon and use the term nemesis, I think that there's some history behind it that there used to be in some politicians, and maybe most, they keep their list of paybacks. And I think in your book you had shared that your dad was very specific on what he wrote, and President Nixon didn't appreciate it and did everything he could to make it tough on your dad.
Yeah, it started at I think it was the first televised debate between Kennedy and Nixon, 1960. And Dad was a young man then, about 32, 33, and he was selected to be NBC's representative on the panel.
Right.
And he asked both candidates tough questions, but specifically he asked Vice President Nixon a tough question about experience, which Nixon had been running on. And Nixon didn't like that and would later call it an event which would plague him for the rest of the campaign. And my dad also thought that Nixon didn't like my dad's coverage of Vietnam. So all of that combined ended up with my dad being on Nixon's initial enemies list.
Right.
People in entertainment, broadcasting, journalism, et cetera, who were targeted by the Nixon administration. And that did cause my dad some heartburn.
Right. And, you know, I remember the debate, and it was the first time that major candidates, certainly for the presidency, had the debate, and your father asking questions, and watching President Nixon just absolutely get so nervous that beads of sweat was all over his upper lip, and he looked uncomfortable. And John F. Kennedy just shined. He loved the camera, and he was great with just natural responses, and it affected the campaign for sure.
You know, even Kennedy back then was a little bit wary about TV because it was so new. But at that point, he understood some things about TV that Nixon didn't. And Kennedy did wear makeup for the debate, and Nixon didn't. And it's interesting from what you were mentioning about appearances, a number of people who didn't watch the debate but listened on the radio thought Nixon had won.
You're right. Now, that debate caused a relationship to get started of trust between your father and John F. Kennedy. Is that right? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's one of those instances in life and politics and TV, I guess, where they just kind of hit it off. They're both kind of young men, up and coming, and they establish a nice bond, which honestly worked to my dad's benefit. He got some nice stories and tips from the Kennedy administration, and that would continue to a degree with RFK, Robert Kennedy. But also there were some moments where they kind of butted head on issues while Kennedy was president. So it was a good relationship with some bumps.
Right. And your dad at that time got a little bit introduced to the power of Hollywood during that time by the Kennedys. I understand from many people, they knew how to have a social function.
Yeah, I think back to Washington, D.C. in the 60s and maybe 70s and maybe not so much now, but I don't know if I want to call it bipartisanship, but something like that. And there was kind of a social whirl in D.C. You could read about it in the Washington Post in the style section when Ben Bradley was the editor. And there was kind of a lively time to be back there. I grew up there. I remember some of those people and some of those events, and I think it was a unique point in history.
I've started using a phrase that I think sometimes, you know, when you start adopting something as your own, you don't know exactly where it came from, but now, as I recall, I think it came from your book. Your dad would say, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, tell him what you're going to tell him, and then tell him what you told him.
Man, if I had $1 for every time he said that to me. And, you know, he started when I was young, and it took a while. As I got older and I started reporting, I began to understand it. That kind of ties into one of the other things I mention in the book about the key to good writing, which I talk about with journalism students today, is know what to leave out. That's the key to good writing. Kind of tell them what you're going to tell them what you've told them.
Right.
And I thought about that while writing the book.
Well, it was excellent. I added something to it for our own work that we do, and since we do so many things now in a virtual space, and then we add a video with B-roll, show them what you told them.
Nice.
So we've added a fourth. Tell me a little bit about the conversations growing up. What is it that caused you to want to follow the footsteps of your father?
Honestly, when I graduated from college from Northwestern, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, so I thought I would try journalism for a few years, see if I liked it. And then about 35 years later, I decided I didn't like it that much, and I stopped.
Mm-hmm.
At what age do you wish you had unlocked the principles that lead to success? Where do you think you'd be today if you had learned them as a child? Yes, Our Kids Can is a program developed at Harvard and tested in San Antonio's school systems, designed to give children of all backgrounds the opportunity to plant the seeds for future success, using learning techniques they understand and enjoy. Through engaging animated stories, fun sing-along songs, and interactive games, Yes, Our Kids Can teaches your child the empowering, success-driven principles needed to reach their full potential. Don't miss this opportunity to give your children the future they deserve. Yes, Our Kids Can is available now on the Apple App Store and Google Play. Sign up today and help make your child's dreams a reality.
So you came to Utah. How?
My dad had a contact who worked with one of the news directors in Salt Lake, and I just graduated from college, and the economy was in pretty rough stage right then, a bit of a recession. So it wasn't a well-paying job, but it was a foot in the door.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd worked for a summer in college at Glacier National Park in Montana.
Mm-hmm.
And I fell in love with the West, so I knew I wanted to be out here, and it just seemed to work. And I thought I'd be here for a few years and then move back east, and that was many decades ago.
How long did you work in Utah in journalism as a reporter, having your own show? How long did you work in Utah?
Give or take about 30 years.
That's right.
And then I did some time in the Midwest in Columbus, Ohio, which I liked, and then retired and came back to Utah.
Well, tell me about your high points in Utah, because there's something that people may or may not know that you broke, a story that went nationwide. Could you tell us about that?
Which one was that? Yeah, I've joked that the Olympic rings are going to be on my gravestone. This would have been 1998. I did a story late in the year about a document which suggested that the local Olympic Committee, the Salt Lake Organizing Committee, might have been paying for the tuition of at least one relative of an IOC member who voted on whether Salt Lake should get the games.
Right.
And I held up that piece of paper on the news that night, and my professional career was never really the same after that.
So tell me about that. What happened?
Well, I did the story, and immediately afterwards, I got a call from Howard Burkus,
Mm-hmm.
who is an excellent reporter. He worked with NPR. He's now retired also. And he said, "Great story. Can you send me the script?" And that's when I started to know, okay, something's going on here. And then it just kind of took on a life of its own. You know, Howard did a great story and other great stories. I know the Deseret News picked it up, and then the Salt Lake Tribune, the other TV stations, and that got national interest, and then that just kind of blew it up. And really for three and a half months, and this is the only time my career had happened, that's the only story I did day after day after day.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. I've wondered whether the timeline might have been accelerated if I'd broken it later and we had things like Twitter, now called
Right.
X, or more social media. I think the spark would have erupted much
Right.
quicker.
Now, was that a positive for your career or a negative?
Both. I mean,
How so?
obviously it got me some recognition, and perhaps some people looked at me anew.
Mm-hmm.
And other people have suggested to me, you know, because you did a story about, in a way, Salt Lake and Utah's power structure, you might have ended up on some enemies lists too.
Right.
And I was spared for most of the incoming,
Mm-hmm.
but I took a few hits.
Right.
But that's to be expected.
And then after that, there was a a change in leadership, obviously. Mitt Romney appeared to save the day, and actually, I'm sure I think you knew this. I think you interviewed my brother Mickey, who was the co-chair with Thurgood Marshall Jr. on behalf of the White House. The Clinton administration has spent a lot of time communicating with Governor Leavitt and Senator Romney on what was needed from the executive branch.
Yeah, I wrote a couple of articles for the Salt Lake City Weekly, and I think the title was, for both of them, Mitt and Me, parts 1 and 2. And it talked about our relationship, how we kind of crossed paths and kind of continued to cross paths as he ran for the president.
Mm-hmm. And was your relationship positive with Mitt?
Yeah, I think so. We had a a type of political relationship where I think we could kid each other.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, when I was going through my dad's files,
Right.
I found a picture of my dad with Mitt Romney's dad, the governor, former governor of Michigan, George Romney. So, of course, I gave that to Mitt, and I think he liked it.
Right. Now, if it hadn't been your story, some would say that Senator Romney's future would have greatly been altered. The Olympics really put him on center stage again, and his run for governor, his run for senator, I believe, was against Edward Kennedy, failed, and then all of a sudden he was back on center stage, and he was known as an executor, an individual that had not only leadership talk, but he had leadership walk. So I'm thinking he ought to be pretty grateful.
Oh, I think he's done okay without my help, but thank you.
Tell me about some of the things that you enjoyed about, I still want to get back to the Chris Vanocur show. What were some of the things that you've talked about with Randy and Bruce and your group that was fun and memorable?
Well, like I say, one of the good things about it was I could kind of pick their brains and learn how Utah politics works and how Utah works. Mm-hmm. One of the things, I can't remember if I put this in the book or not, but my dad would mention to me how politics teaches you about life. You see the very best in people and the very worst. And also that life isn't black or white, it's mostly gray in between. And it took me a while after covering politics for a few years to kind of incorporate these lessons into my reporting and into my life. But I think it was a great education.
Well, it was a fun show to watch. Tell me about your career. You've mentioned a couple of times retired.
Yes.
Tell me about the fourth quarter of Chris Vanocur's life.
Wow, we're in the last quarter unless there's some overtime.
Well, there's always overtime. I'm living overtime.
When I was done in Columbus, Ohio, I came back to Utah, and I think my pilot light was kind of diminished at that point. I'd been doing it 30, 35 years, and I'm kind of like you, or I was. I worked all the time.
Right.
Enjoyed it, and there were a lot of benefits to it, but I just wanted to experience some new things. And in addition to writing the book, one of the things I really enjoyed is kind of traveling around the world. And I've done some writing about that, but to me, that's been a great education and pleasure.
So I've oftentimes shared with people there's two kinds of compensation. And first and foremost, for those of us that come from maybe a not having enough, it's always the compensation of capital. But the real compensation is the second level, which is experiences and relationships. And it sounds to me like when you're in your traveling, seeing, feeling, relationships, that's the major compensation in life, I believe. Where have you gone that absolutely just caused you to pause and say, wow?
Well, I'm a big fan still to this day of the late Anthony Bourdain. Mm-hmm. And he helped educate me about travel. And in terms of where I've been, I kind of break it up into scenic areas like the fjords of Norway, the Norway coast. I think that's just beautiful, as is the Inner Passage in Alaska. And then there are more cultural places. I just got back from Japan, which I absolutely love.
I've never been. I gotta go.
Some people think that once you've been to Japan, you've crossed a traveling threshold because it's so unique, so different, so wonderful that you've really kind of, I don't know if elevated is the right word, but you've really transformed yourself into a different type of traveler.
Wow. Well, I'm going to look forward to that. So tell me, what are you going to do over the next 20 years? What's your passion?
Really, all I had down on my to-do list was this podcast.
Well, I'm glad I was able to accommodate.
Now I'm adrift. Some people, friends of mine, have urged me to write another book specifically about traveling. And I'm also an amateur photographer, and I've taken quite a few pictures. So I'm thinking about it. As you well know, writing is work.
It is work. Real work.
My dad kept repeating the quote, and I'm not going to get it exactly right, but I think it came from a newspaper writer who talked, maybe an author, who talked about sitting at the typewriter and just kind of bleeding out onto all of it. It really takes quite a bit of effort, and it takes quite a bit out of you. So I'm now debating if I want to do that again.
Well, I tell you, it's having some coffee table books with images, photography of where you've been might be a good idea as well, because you can tell a lot of stories in pictures. And I find myself just liking to gaze and look at a picture, and it gives me the motivation. I'm going to go there.
You travel quite a bit. Do you take pictures when you go?
I don't. You know, one of the things that has been absolutely irritating to me is having to take pictures everywhere you go with your iPhone or whatever, and it takes away from just being present and just letting it seep in, to just sit and watch something and look at it. And for me, I still, Chris, I pinch myself and say, never in my life did I dream that the son of a Zapotec Mexican Indian, a farm laborer, would get to do what I do. So when I'm there, I just want to take it in. I want to take it in.
You know, it's funny you mentioned that. This last trip I just got back from, it was actually a month-long cruise around Asia. And on the first or second day, I'm not usually big into mantras or sayings and that kind of thing. But a gentleman, very subtly on his arm of his shirt, it said, "Appreciate the moment." Yeah. And that really became the theme for this trip. And I've also kind of kept it with me since I've been back. And I think that's what you just pointed out.
Exactly. I certainly, you don't need any advice from me, but I'll tell you what, there's not enough traveling shows. And to wander this earth, my last project I want is to have a traveling show where I visit people that have become disciples of Think and Grow Rich by Dr. Napoleon Hill, something that I spend a lot of time as a disciple of his work, giving seminars on, of interviewing them and just their families and their town, their businesses. How did this change your life? And sharing good stories. So when you say a traveling show, that has been I want to end my career with that.
Well, I think that there's been a void since Bourdain left us.
Yes.
I enjoy Stanley Tucci's travels through Italy.
Yeah.
Well done. He's very charming, but on a different level, it's not quite the same.
No, it is not. It is not the same. Have you ever given any thought to doing something like that just for fun? Because there's plenty of places to. There's so many channels out there looking for content today.
I've given it some thought, but kind of to your point, I just want to enjoy the moment. I don't want to work.
Yeah.
I watch videos quite a bit before I travel. Once I get my itinerary straight, I'll watch some YouTube videos, and I started watching TikTok videos.
Yes.
Because they're quite educational.
Yes.
But at some point, I watch these people and I think, yeah, they're going to these places, but they're just working.
Well, I'm with you on that. I tell you what, I don't want my phone out. I want to sit and gaze and just look. Chris, I wanted to give you a copy of my new book, Live Ready, Beyond Think and Grow Rich. This is a modern version. As a disciple of Dr. Napoleon Hill, I was authorized to write this book, modernizing and telling the story in my voice. And I want to thank you very much for being in our program. And before you leave today, I'm going to have you sign my book of Sanders' study. And I really, really enjoyed this book. And folks listening, if you want to know about history and you want to know about the news and you want to know about a story about a son and a father, this book is a must read. Thank you for being on our program.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your support of the book.